I'm done with everything having to do with the mechanics of the class. All right. If you don't know, if you're kind of unsure about what to do next, you should ask me. Right. It's all in the syllabus, and I will try to keep you apprised of what's going on next. All right. So, but I don't want to spend the whole day going through the syllabus because my experience is that it's a waste of time because you'll forget it anyway, right? So I would just as soon plow into our study of history. And the question is, why? Why do we study history? How many of you are planning on being historians? That's what I thought. Nobody is going to be a historian. How many of you guys are taking this class just because you love history? And be honest now. Okay, a couple of you, maybe three, right? How many of you are, or there's actually more, there's 5 or so, right? How many of you guys are taking this class because you have to? You can't graduate without it. Okay, so come on, be honest, right? All right. So that's the thing about history, is that generally speaking, Americans are not very interested in our history. I mean, some people think it's really interesting, and we like to study battles and great people and speeches and stuff like that. But for the most part, Americans don't think of, we don't identify with our history. Instead, we identify as people that are moving into the future. Right? The whole thing about the American kind of way of looking at the world has been that we're leading the world into the future. So if we're leading the world into the future, why bother looking at the past, right? And that's really a kind of an American characteristic. Americans really don't know their history very well. Like, for example, if you went to Mexico or any Latin American country or most European countries, other places in the world, everybody knows their history. Their history is part of them. But in the United States, it's just, it's that thing that is on the History Channel. And it might be interesting, but what's it got to do with me, right? But there's a good reason why we study history, and the way that I want to start off by trying to impress that upon you is to ask you to imagine that you wake up in a hospital and you're like your age, whatever your age is, 20 years old, something like that, right? And you wake up in a hospital and you don't remember anything. Right? You don't remember who you are. You don't remember what you have. You don't remember what you know. Right? You don't remember what your skills are. You don't remember who's your relation. You don't remember any of your relationships. How would you be able to move ahead in life at that point? Somebody answer me. You don't remember anything. So how can you move ahead in life? What are you going to do next? Nobody wants to answer that.
Just ask somebody?
You can ask somebody. That's a great thing. And you're right. That's the only way we would ever be able to figure it out, right? We would ask somebody. But think about this now. Let's say that you're the one that doesn't have any memory, and I want to take advantage of that. So you ask me, hey, Professor Cox, or whoever you are, tell me about myself. I don't remember anything. And I'll say, well, I actually loaned you $500,000, right? You remember that? and you agreed that you were going to wash my car, right? And you get what I'm saying, right? I could use your ignorance of history to manipulate you into doing things that are not in your interest.
Indoctrination?
Well, it's like indoctrination, but it's more than that, because Yeah, you could say it's indoctrination in terms of using history as a kind of an identity building tool, right? So now, most of you guys studied history in elementary school and in junior high school or middle school and in high school, right? But what I'm going to tell you now, and you won't like probably, is that all of that history that you learned really wasn't history. Generally speaking, I can't say that for everybody, right? But what it really was is a repetition of our national myth. And why do we repeat our national myth? And why do we get our kids to learn our national myth? Well, the reason why is because we want them to become good Americans, right? We want them to be raised with pride in America. We want them to remember how, or to realize how great we are as Americans, right? And so really what we end up learning is a kind of a glossed over treatment of what happened in the past, okay? And one of the reasons why people in general are critical of college level professors and historians is because when we look at history, we have to look at it in terms of what actually happened rather than in terms of what message am I trying to bring, right? So it's not possible that I, as a historian or any other historian, could ever say history in an unbiased way, unless I sat here and just recited dates, right? But at the same time, as a historian, it's our responsibility to try to understand what really happened, keeping in mind that there are many different accounts and many different points of view, right? So the job of the historian isn't just to remember names and dates. The job of the historian is to try to understand what happened in the past so that we can understand how it affects our present. Okay. Now, you guys are all with me on this? Let's do this next thing. What I want you to do, and I want you to think about this, we're going to do a little thought exercise. And I want somebody to tell me, what does a patriot look like? And let's just talk about this in terms of American history, what we know about American history and American colonial times and the revolution, that sort of thing, right? Not football players, right? But what does a patriot look like?
Someone who's loyal to their government, to their home country, their people,
Okay,
going to lay down their life
You're good on all that.
for their values.
That's all true.
I don't know about the loyalty part though, necessarily, because sometimes a patriot is somebody who stands up against the powers that be, that it might be your own country. And
You could be. You're right, Aaron.
They were fighting their own country, wasn't it? Because like during colonial times, when they were still technically considered part of Britain.
Well, yeah, okay. It depends on what you think of as your country. But when you say you stand up to the powers that be, it's probably true, most often true, that when you're standing up to the powers that be, it's because the powers that be have betrayed the nation, right? And that's exactly what happened in the American Revolution. So now what I want you to think about, though, is if you were going to draw a picture of a patriot, what would that picture look like? Would it be a man or a woman?
I don't think you could draw a picture.
You don't think you could draw a picture?
I think would be someone holding their flag, their nation's flag, I guess.
Okay, and keep in mind, I'm talking about now at the time of the Boston Tea Party, right? So I didn't tell you that, but I want you to think about, at the time of the Boston Tea Party, if you were to draw a picture of a patriot, what would that patriot look like?
It would be a white man.
A white man. How is he dressed? Is he dressed in all rich, fancy clothes?
Like more worn down, probably.
Yeah, more like maybe like a working class person, right? like a maybe a smith or a farming or some, farmer or something like that. Okay, and he wears a hat, right? What kind of hat does he wear?
3-point.
Yeah, the
Yes.
tricorn hat, right? And then he probably has a musket, right? So let's take a look here and look at this. How about that? Does that look like a patriot? What do you guys think?
Like from elementary.
I'm sorry?
Looks like what I saw in the elementary books, like the little workbooks they give us.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what we think of as a patriot, okay?
Was
I-
it Paul Revere?
I'm sorry? No, I don't know who that is. It's just a picture, right? The
He
point
looks-
though, the point, it's a stereotype actually is what it is, all right? And so now let's think about, and I'm going back to talk about the Boston Tea Party, right? Does anybody know about the Boston Tea Party? You guys all know about the Boston Tea Party, right? Tell me about the Boston Tea Party, just in short.
Angry colonists throwing British tea into like the water.
Into the
Against the
harbor,
tea tax.
against the tea tax. So they were against the tea tax, and they threw the tea in the harbor, right? Now, when we think about the people who did
Masquerade
that,
as natives.
yeah, they were dressed as Native Americans, which is interesting, right? But why did they, when we think about who did that, right? What do we think about them? Were they patriots?
I guess to us they are. I mean, if another view could see them
Okay.
otherwise.
What we have been brought up to believe that they are patriots, right? Am I right about that? That's the way we've been educated. They're patriots, all right? Now, you may or may not know this. Probably some of you do and some of you don't, right? But the people that we consider to be the Tea Party patriots were actually, they were a group known as the Sons of Liberty. And this Sons of Liberty was a lot like, I think, we could think about, if we were thinking about it in terms of the current events, they were a lot like Antifa or the Proud Boys. You get what I'm saying? They were kind of extra legal. They weren't working within the system. They were actually against the government. They were trying to bring it down, right? Okay, and so the rest of us in the middle, the great Americans, the good Americans, right, are actually the good American colonists at that time. The good American colonists at that time are looking at these people, the Sons of Liberty, as dangerous thugs, right? You guys got that? They were dangerous, okay? When they threw all that tea in the harbor, we think of that as a great event, right? That they threw all that tea in the harbor, and that really showed that King George, right? But in reality, people like George Washington said, that's crazy. You don't want to throw the tea in the harbor because it's private property. And they were all about private property. They weren't about liberty or any of that stuff, right? We'll talk more about that as we go on, right? But the main thing to say here is that we think of them as patriots, but the people who lived at the time, most of them didn't think of them as patriots, right? So why is it that they are patriots now when they weren't then?
Well, it takes time to look back and reflect upon the events once you've analyzed them and kind of go, okay, they were or weren't moving things towards a better society.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that?
Revised history,
I'm sorry?
like a revised history or like a cleaned up.
Okay. So we, how many of you guys know about how many of you guys have ever heard of the Sons of Liberty before?
I have no
A
idea.
few. Do you know that they did things like tar and feather people, and they did things like burn? They burned the governor in effigy. They've actually burned down the governor's house and stole his dishes, and they sank ships, and they threw rocks at soldiers and things like that. Does that sound like somebody that's a patriot? I mean,
Perhaps in another perspective.
does that sound like somebody that you would want to emulate? Not really, right? So that part gets left out. You don't learn any of that in, I don't know when you guys study U.S. history in school anymore, but you know, in elementary school or middle school, you don't learn any of that, right? Or very little of it, if any, right? Okay, so why not? Why don't we learn that stuff?
To indoctrinate, perhaps,
Okay, because we want people to be
American ideal.
exactly. We want to raise people to be good Americans, right? And up till now, the thought has always been that if you want people to be good Americans, then you don't want to tell them about the bad stuff. You know what I mean? But history is really a long, tragic story. It's not a story of triumph to triumph, right? It's actually, there are triumphs there. There are great things that happen, but there are also things that are not so great that happen as well, right?
People to live a lie.
And we want to know those things. I'm saying this now. We want to know those things so that we can avoid them in the future, right? Or in the present. Okay, we want to know what happened in the past so we can avoid those things in the present, right? So we don't want to sugarcoat things and say things were always okay. Now think about this, and you know, there's a little assignment I've given you guys. But think about this: how many of you guys have heard of a modern political movement called the Tea Party? Have you guys heard of them? Tell me about the Tea Party. Tell me about the Tea Party. What is their political orientation? Are they
Conservative, Republican?
Conservative Republicans, right? Okay. And why do you think they call themselves the Tea Party?
They wanted to kind of adopt the same type of patriot view.
Exactly. They want to associate themselves with the Tea Party patriots, right? How many of them do you think realize the true history of the Boston Tea Party and the Sons of Liberty? You follow what I'm saying here? So the point I'm trying to make here is that because our history has been so distorted over time, people can infer things about history that are really just not true, right? You follow what I'm saying here? And why can they do that? The reason why they can do that is because we don't know our history. If we knew our history, we could say, well, that's not really true. What you guys are saying is not true. But we don't know it. And because we don't know it, then anybody can tell us anything and say, oh, yeah, well, I guess that's right. You follow what I'm saying? Do you think anybody would want to fool you that way with history? Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's basically what American politics is to try to fool you about what it was like in the past, right? So that you can, like, for example, I mean, many people today, we're going to go back to the good old days, the good old days in the 1950s when, black people were segregated and women couldn't work and things like that. Because those were the good old days, right? That was when America was great, okay? You guys got that, right? What I want us to do is I want you to take a minute and read what's on this page. You guys got it? So, what does Abraham Lincoln mean when he says we cannot escape history? Let me give you some happens. Let me give you some background. This is a letter that was written to Congress in 1862, and it was stating the case for ending slavery, and that was a shocking idea in the United States in 1862. The idea of ending slavery was something that was incredibly radical. And Lincoln had his reasons for doing it, but he believed that slavery was the major issue that was tearing the country apart. And so he thought that to save the nation, he needed to free the slaves. But in order to do that, he had to have Congress on board with him. So he wrote a letter to Congress, and this is what he wrote in that letter. Okay. So now, having said that, what do you think he means when he says we cannot escape history?
I think what he means to say is kind of just the overall concept of history always repeats itself.
Okay. I'm glad you said that. Although I disagree. I don't think history repeats itself, but I do think it rhymes. And let me tell you what I mean by that. What I mean by that is the exact same thing doesn't happen over and over again. But what we notice is that people make the same kinds of mistakes over and over again, right? Why do you think that people make the same kinds of mistakes over and over again?
Ignorance to history.
Ignorance to history. We don't know what our history is. I think that, generally speaking, say that our history, our historical memory is about 2 generations, right? Which means that anything that happened earlier than my generation for you guys is forgotten, right? And that means that we don't know how to face challenges like the rise of totalitarianism and things like that, because we never had to do it. And nobody that we know ever had to do it. You know what I'm saying? And so then when we see what's happening in the world and we act the same way that our grandparents acted, right? And we get the same results, then we say, well, history repeated itself. But it's not that history repeated itself, it's that we didn't know what our history was to begin with. And we made the same mistakes we made before, right? You guys get what I'm saying? I want you to know every student that I've ever had has believed when they started my class that history repeats itself. But history does not repeat itself. What happens is that people make the same stupid mistakes over and over again because they don't know their history, our history. All right, so that's one thing. So anyway, when we say we cannot escape history, well, yeah, we could say something similar might happen again in the future, but that's not really what he's talking about here. What do you think he's talking about?
I think he's talking about that you can whether you stand by, do nothing, whether you act or whether you act against, it goes down as the history. So
right,
it just happens. History just happens. It's the passing of time and what happened before. So whatever you do, it's going to go down in history. There's no getting away from it, sidestepping it, and hoping it all works out.
That's excellent, Aaron. I think that I'm going to give you a star. You like that? So you guys think, oh, stars, they're lame, but wait till you get one, you'll like it, right? But the thing is, that's right on it, right? So Lincoln is saying here, people in the future are going to look at us and they're going to say, what did they do? They were in this crisis. How did they act, right? And he said, you can't escape that. So what are we going to do? Are we going to do something that will make people in the future proud and happy that we did what we did? Or are we going to do something that will make people in the future ashamed of what we did? Because no matter what we do, we're making history, right? So does that make sense to you guys? So if that's true, then where does history happen? In time. Where does history happen? When we think about history, we think about the past, right? Dead white men, things like that. The Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, right? But history is happening when?
Every day.
It's happening right now. We're making history right now. All of us sitting here on our little Zooms are making history right now. Probably nobody's going to remember it. Hopefully you guys will, at least I'm still a test, right? But you get what I'm saying though, right? History's happening right now. So history's not about the past. It's about right now. But there's something else too, right? And just think about what does he think that this means? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. what does that tell us? What's he saying there? Think about now when he's talking about slavery and the abolition of slavery, right? What would be the dogmas of the quiet past?
You're saying like the way things were,
Right,
just because it was the way things were doesn't mean that
exactly.
it's going to help us deal with the current issues of the day.
Exactly. So now let's say Abraham Lincoln is saying we need to deal with the situation we've got today. What does history tell us? What we've been doing, what? Didn't work. What we've been doing didn't work. So the history is also about the past, right? We learn from what happened before so that we can shape the future, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar. Some of you guys probably have read 1984. Have you read that before? And Orwell says in there, which is actually true, whoever controls the past controls the present. Whoever controls the present controls the future. You guys get what I'm saying? That's actually true. I mean, even though the party said that in the book, right? That's actually true, right? That's how powerful historical memory is, or lack of it. Because if we don't remember, then we're likely to do something stupid, which is, I mean, if you look at American politics and society today, and you look at the level of historical knowledge of people today, you can see a direct correlation. People don't know our history, and so they do stupid things, right? How does history help us as citizens?
It helps reflect on how we are.
Right, but why would we need to know history as a citizen?
Well, you can spot things. You can spot things that were, so like a big one today would be censorship. And maybe it's small and it's aligned with something you believe in right now, but that censorship, that's the beginnings of a totalitarian government.
Okay, all right, so that's good, right? But now if we have this historical knowledge, how will that make a difference
You can
for
pivot.
us as citizens, right?
You can pivot instead of going down the same path.
How do we express our will as citizens?
Voting and protesting.
Voting and protesting, but voting for sure, right? And that means then that if we don't know our history, how do we know what to vote for? How can we make wise decisions? You follow what I'm saying? So this is why it's so important for you who are going to be taking over the world pretty quickly from people like me, right? To know what's going on, where we came from, so that you can make wise decisions about the present and the future, right? You guys get what I'm saying? Questions, comments? So that's why we study history. It's not just so that fuddy-duddies like me have something to do on Tuesday afternoon, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here, and this we've kind of talked about a little bit. Americans look to the future with hope. Mexicans look to the past with regret. Okay, so this is actually a quote from a Mexican author, Octavio Paz, who was writing. He was actually a Mexican author, but he was raised in Washington, D.C. And so he considered himself to be kind of a bridge between Spanish American culture and American culture. And he wrote a book, and the name of the book was El Laberinto de la Soledad, or the Labyrinth of Solitude, and it was it won the Nobel Prize, okay, way back like 1950 or something like that. But at any rate, the book has a comparison of Americans and Mexicans, American culture and Mexican culture, right? And one of the things that he observes is that Mexicans are steeped in the past, right? If you know anything about Mexican history, which you will know some about in this class, right? If you know anything about Mexican history, you know that it's tragic, right? That Mexico was conquered over and over and over again, starting with the the Spanish, and then moving on to the French and the Americans, and Spanish again, right? And so Mexicans have this kind of tragic sense of their own history, and it shapes the way that they look at the world. Okay, Americans, as I've already demonstrated, really don't care too much about history. It's like, it's interesting, it's good as a tool to make citizens, but we're going into the future, so forget about history. We don't care about that, right? Okay, so now on the one hand, people are kind of are kind of held down by history, and on the other hand, people are completely ignorant of history, right? Which do you think is better?
Being bogged down in history.
You think being bogged down? That's actually a trick. I appreciate your answer, James, but that's actually a trick question, because neither one of them really is better, is it? What's
Well,
really
God.
better? What's really better is if we know, we can see with clear eyes what happened in the past, so that we can move. Again, I've said this before, so I don't want to beat myself up. What do they call it? Dead horse, right? Okay. All right. Last thing. I'm going to skip the one in the middle because I forgot who said it. Okay. You guys watch the inauguration of Biden? Anybody watch that? You remember the poet Amanda Gorman? She was a young black woman who did this poem. It was a great poem. But this is one of the things that she said, and I thought this is really appropriate for us as students of history. While we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. You know, think about, again, I'm talking about U.S. history here, and we're going to be in world history starting on Thursday, right? But I'm talking about just history in general at this point. And one of the things that we look at, if we look at the documents about the American Revolution, about the government that they were creating, people were writing at the time that we have the responsibility for millions yet unborn. You see, they really, I think in that case, they really appreciated their responsibility to history. Do we? I'll let you guys answer that yourselves. Okay. But now I'm finished.